Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today really digs into a fundamental split in how we think about criminal justice policy and public safety strategies. We're drawing this from the source material we've both analyzed.
That's right. And the material lays out this classic clash, really, backed by evidence. On one hand, you have approaches that prioritize deterrence, focusing on, consistent enforcement, swift consequences.
Right.
And on the other, strategies centered on prevention, things like precision targeting, addressing root causes, trying to minimize unnecessary incarceration.
Exactly. And this divide, it really shapes almost every major policy debate we see today, doesn't it? From how police operate on the street to sentencing reform.
Absolutely.
So for today's debate, I'll be arguing for the necessity of strong, consistent enforcement. The idea that this is the bedrock for liberty and prosperity, what we're calling the deterrent level.
And I'll be approaching it, well, differently. I'm making the case for what the material calls smart safety. This means emphasizing targeted, precise enforcement, making sure police legitimacy is strong, and really structurally addressing the root causes of violence. So I'm advocating for the prevention model, seeking a path that's, demonstrably effective but also sustainable.
Okay, so let me lay out my position. Public safety. It's not just another policy goal. It's the absolute precondition for a functioning society. I mean, if neighborhoods, if businesses are facing constant disorder, unpredictable violence, then prosperity, liberty, they're fundamentally curtailed. So our core thesis is straightforward. Strong, certain enforcement sends the necessary deterrent signal. Punishments need to be swift, they need to be certain. We have to advocate for firm sentences, particularly for those who commit violent acts, and critically for chronic, repeat offenders. And we need to use targeted strategies to tackle the most immediate threats. For example, we strongly support focused gun crime prosecutions, models like Project Safe Neighborhoods. This isn't just a catchy name. It's a real mechanism. It prioritizes using federal resources and often, let's be frank, federal mandatory minimums for the most serious cases. Like when someone already convicted of a felony is caught with a gun illegally. That sends a very clear signal there are firm consequences for high-risk behavior. Our policing strategy has to be proactive. It needs to be data-driven. This means supporting approaches like CompStat. That's a strategy demanding rapid, organizational follow-up on specific crime trends. It treats crime almost like an organizational problem that needs quick containment through things like hotspot patrols. When visible disorder clearly fuels more serious crime, we must prioritize restoring order, whether that's through focused crackdowns on organized retail theft rings or even chronic quality-of-life offenses. And crucially, our judicial posture has to ensure policies like bail reform are handled cautiously, making sure high-risk defendants can be detained pre-trial. Clarity, predictability, and consequences. That's what every stable community fundamentally needs.
Okay. That's clearly laid out. Though I would frame the relationship between effectiveness and safety, well, a bit differently. We absolutely agree safety is paramount, but I'd argue effectiveness and fairness are really inextricably linked. You can't really have one without the other in the long run. Our core thesis is that true smart safety, as the material terms it, is achieved by focusing our scarce resources where they actually matter most, on serious violence. We need to use precision enforcement to target the specific, often small, high-harm networks. Sometimes it's just a few dozen individuals in an entire city who are driving the vast majority of shootings.
This approach, it's often known as focused deterrence, sometimes called the ceasefire model. Basically, you identify the people most involved in violence, you communicate directly and clearly, stop the shooting, and we will offer you comprehensive services, real help like housing, jobs. But, and this is key, if you reoffend, the full force of the law, it comes down swiftly and surely. This targeted focus, it allows us to responsibly use alternatives for others. We advocate for evidence-based pretrial release, but with supportive supervision, and diversion programs for lower-level offenses, especially those driven by substance use or mental health issues. Why? Because honestly, unnecessary time in jail often acts like a revolving door. It disrupts employment, destabilizes families, and actually increases the likelihood of future crime. it pushes up recidivism. Furthermore, legitimacy, it's absolutely key to safety.
We have to emphasize police accountability, things like transparent discipline, de-escalation training, co-responder models where mental health professionals respond alongside police to certain 911 calls. The fact is, most crime is concentrated, so precision beats blanket policies every time. And building legitimacy is probably the single best way to boost witness cooperation, which, as you know, directly improves clearance rates for the most serious crimes.
Okay, let's dive into some of these tensions. Let's start where the rubber meets the road, the actual efficacy of enforcing disorder and quality of life offenses. Your model seems less focused on this, whereas ours bets heavily on the idea that visible disorder does fuel serious crime. That makes proactive crackdowns essential for, well, restoring order quickly. You mentioned CompStat and hotspot policing. We cite the crime declines in places like New York City during the 90s and 2000s, often linked to adopting exactly those strategies.
Right. The NYC example always comes up.
Well, the correlation is compelling, I think, as the mechanism seems pretty clear. Businesses, residents, they interpret visible disorder, graffiti, broken windows, rampant shoplifting as a signal that, frankly, no one's in control. By restoring order quickly, maybe through focused retail theft task forces like we discussed, police are signaling. They're signaling to potential criminals and to law-abiding citizens that the social contract is still enforced. This creates the stability needed for people to invest in their community, for witnesses to feel safer cooperating. So we argue we aren't just enforcing small crimes, we're actively managing the behavioral norms in critical areas.
But see, I have to challenge that premise on disorder enforcement. While I agree rapid deployment to crime spikes is crucial, relying heavily on broad quality of life crackdowns, that's a significant vulnerability, I think, for the deterrence model. It carries a real risk of over-policing, of essentially criminalizing poverty, and it can severely strain police community trust. Let me ask this, just analytically, how do you definitively measure the direct causal link between, say, a crackdown on minor retail theft and an actual reduction in homicides?
Well, the link is complex, but the overall trend...
Because the source material does point out that these broad crackdowns often result in disparate impacts, particularly on minority communities. And when that trust erodes, and it does, the effectiveness of any policing strategy suffers deeply because witnesses simply won't cooperate. That directly hurts clearance rates for the very serious crimes, the homicides, the shootings that you rightly want to stop. We saw this play out in places where high-volume stop-and-frisk strategies, alienated entire communities. I'd argue cost-effective safety is achieved by surgically targeting those small, high-harm networks driving the shootings, not through blanket policies that risk alienating the very public you need as partners.
I'd argue the data does support the connection between consistent enforcement of disorder and overall safety over the long term, even if isolating the short-term causal link to a single homicide is admittedly difficult. The mechanism is more about aggregated public behavior and perceptions of safety. But okay, let's shift from the street level to the courtroom. Let's talk about that inherent trade-off you mentioned between deterrence and incarceration.
Okay.
The deterrence signal, as I said, it must be absolutely clear and certain. In achieving that certainty, well, it requires firm sentences for violent and chronic repeat offenders. And yes, it requires judicial policies like cautious bail reform to ensure the detention of genuinely high-risk defenders before trial. The failure of poorly designed, overly broad pretrial release reforms, which the source material documents quite well, can allow high-risk individuals to just cycle right back onto the streets. That signals system leniency, maybe even incompetence. And that failure, it critically undermines public confidence, which is just fatal to the entire system's legitimacy. We simply cannot compromise the necessity of incapacitation for those few individuals who pose the greatest repeated threat to life.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the marginal return of adding, say, another decade onto an already long sentence outweighs the staggering social and financial cost and the subsequent harm of mass incarceration. And let me tell you why. The research we have suggests that once a person has served a certain amount of time, often around 5 to 7 years, the marginal deterrent effect of adding another decade or even 2, it drops off dramatically. Meanwhile, the cost to taxpayers just explodes.
But the incapacitation effect is still there.
But is it efficient safety? That's the question. We should be using data and proportionality to ensure the sentence actually fits the harm caused and the real public safety value, rather than just maximizing time served as a default. I mean, look at the federal level. The First Step Act, that was a genuinely bipartisan reform effort. It showed we could reduce penalties for some nonviolent, lower-level offenses and significantly expand reentry programs without compromising public safety. In fact, there's strong evidence that unnecessary incarceration demonstrably increases recidivism because it severs family ties, destroys employment prospects, it produces more future crime, not less. We just have to be smarter about who we punish and for how long.
Okay, but if we don't ensure that baseline certainty, how does the system maintain the structural credibility that's needed even for your focused deterrence models to work? I mean, those models rely heavily on the credible threat of firm consequences if the targeted individual rejects the services offered, right?
They do, yes.
So if the justice system is perceived as incapable of actually following through, maybe because of constant reform churn or perceived judicial softness, then those target individuals, they won't believe the threat. And then the whole prevention model kind of collapses, doesn't it? Certainty, I argue, must precede effective leniency or diversion.
Not just sheer volume of incarceration. The key to focused deterrence isn't locking up 200,000 people hoping to scare 200 specific individuals. It's about ensuring that small, high-harm group knows they are being watched and they know the response will be certain and tailored if they continue the violence. It's about focus. And this really brings us naturally to the issue of legitimacy and cooperation, which I touched on earlier. My core argument here is that legitimacy isn't some, soft policy goal. It is an absolutely essential investment in long-run public safety. When national narratives or highly visible negative local incidents reduce community trust, we enter what the material calls the trust spiral. That's where residents, understandably perhaps, refuse to cooperate with police investigations, and this directly cripples the ability of law enforcement to solve serious crimes. Homicide clearance rates plummet when witnesses are silent.
Right, clearance rates are a problem.
Exactly. So investing proactively in police accountability, things like transparent disciplinary systems, robust early warning systems for officer misconduct, widespread use of properly audited body cameras, this isn't merely punitive, it's a structural way to rebuild cooperation and ensure the long-term effectiveness of the entire law enforcement mission. You simply cannot solve crime effectively without community intelligence.
Look, I'm not entirely convinced that focusing so heavily on accountability as the primary mechanism for safety is practical or, frankly, fast enough in a crisis. While officer quality, better pay, training, tools like body cams, these are vital, and it's something our model supports too. But critics of the prevention model, as noted in the material, point out that the actual implementation of many of these accountability and prevention initiatives is incredibly uneven across jurisdictions.
Implementation is always a challenge, sure.
And capacity shortfalls are a very real barrier. If you divert someone from jail, say, for substance use treatment, but the city has a 3-month waiting list for an effective service slot, well, then the intended benefit is severely blunted, isn't it? It leaves a potential safety gap. Furthermore, we cannot ignore the public perception of leniency. The messaging around accountability, when it's perceived by the public, rightly or wrongly, as softness or as making excuses for criminal behavior, that can also erode the public confidence that is absolutely necessary for any proactive enforcement efforts to succeed. In moments of crisis, the public often demands a strong signal of control before it fully trusts calls for deeper reform.
Well, the perception of softness is often, frankly, manufactured or amplified by siloed media narratives. We need to be careful to distinguish between perception and the on-the-ground reality. The reality is, the communities most impacted by violence, they want effective policing. But they also desperately need police who are seen as legitimate actors within the community. A quick enforcement response that leads to a long-term erosion of trust, that's ultimately a net safety loss. A focus on building legitimacy is the long-term enforcement strategy because it guarantees the kind of cooperation that solves cold cases and helps prevent future retaliatory violence.
I agree that clearance rates are critical. Nobody disputes that. But in the immediate term, when violence spikes, which, remember, the deterrence model is fundamentally designed to prevent or quickly suppress a system that signals rapid, certain consequences, is often the only thing that arrests that spiral of fear and restores immediate order. Sometimes you have to address the present crisis, the fire burning now, before you can fully invest in the longer-term structural prevention. Because structural prevention takes time and violence demands a response now.
Conclusion. So wrapping up my side, the core argument really remains this. A stable, prosperous society requires firm, consistent consequences. It needs proactive enforcement strategies like CompStat, like using federal tools effectively against gun crime, to establish those fundamental preconditions for liberty.
Deterrence, and yes, focused incapacitation for repeat violent offenders. These are the non-negotiable foundations, I believe, upon which any subsequent prevention or reform effort has to be built. The system must operate with certainty to be credible at all.
And from my perspective, the most effective safety, the smartest safety, it's achieved not just through punishment, but through that surgical, precision targeting of the highest harm crime networks. It requires structural prevention efforts and policies that genuinely address underlying causes while working hard to reduce recidivism. By prioritizing legitimacy, by investing intelligently in programs proven to change behavior, we create a long-term safety model that maximizes public benefit while using incarceration only when it's truly necessary and proportional.
It's clear, isn't it, that the sheer complexity of this issue, and maybe exacerbated, as you hinted, by modern divisions, siloed media, sometimes metric cherry-picking to support a pre-existing view, it naturally leads to these distinct philosophical approaches.
Absolutely. It's a tough set of problems with no easy answers. But what I find encouraging, and it's noted in the source material too, is the existence of practical bridging ideas, real-world examples where these approaches can converge. For instance, the most effective implementations of focused deterrence that I mentioned, they are often paired with very firm consequences for those individuals who refuse the offered services and continue violence.
Right.
Likewise, hotspot policing doesn't have to mean alienating communities. It can be implemented with strong guardrails like mandatory body cam auditing, strict supervisory review to maintain legitimacy while still maximizing the impact on crime hotspots. These examples, I think, suggest that convergence between consistent enforcement and targeted fairness isn't just wishful thinking. It's absolutely possible.
That's a fair point. And ultimately, the source material reminds us that policy shouldn't be judged by political labels or gut feelings, but by a shared, comprehensive scoreboard. We really need to look beyond just the headlines to objective metrics, homicide and shooting rates, yes, but also clearance rates, recidivism rates, the degree of racial disparities in police stops and arrests, and, crucially, measures of community trust from surveys.
Exactly. It's that full picture.
So, we leave it to the listener, as always, to weigh these distinct philosophies and the evidence presented against that objective reality.